we enter with Jesus into a deserted place, a wilderness, a place of precarity and possibility, of risk and revelation. Jesus goes by boat, the people from the villages and towns go by foot, and when he disembarked from the boat, he saw a great crowd, and he began curing the sick among them out of compassion for the crowds. The whole scene begins with compassion and healing for bodies in need. But as evening approached, the disciples came and said what so many good Christian folks have said in every century since, when the church's perceived scarcity meets the world's great needs. Send them away. Now, there's no reason to think that they lacked faith that Jesus could feed them, or that they had any idea at this point that his miracles extended to the multiplication of food. They were being pragmatic. Folks are getting hungry, it's getting late, let's get them into the villages and out of the wilderness so they can get a little food. It's an understandable impulse. Nothing inherently wrong with that. Then, Jesus says one of the most radically political statements in all of the Gospels. You feed them. Here's why understanding context is so important. This story takes place, and the entire Gospel is written during a time of Roman occupation. And the mythology surrounding the Roman emperor said that sustenance comes from the emperor. The emperor feeds the people. Roman coins often featured cornucopias of fruit and wheat to drive home this point to people. And when you can really get people to believe in the power of the empire to take care of them, to feed them, is when things are scarce. They're taking your jobs, they're taking your health care, there's not enough to go around, I'll take care of you. The disciples, seeing scarcity, want to send the people out to barter and trade and buy food in the markets of the imperial economy. And Jesus says, no, you feed them. A direct challenge to the well-ingrained narrative of the empire. And in that moment, the story goes from being a nice little tale about a miraculous picnic to a dangerous narrative that challenges the mythos of Rome. Suddenly, scarcity is met with abundance, and it's not the empire's economy caring for the needs of the people. And that, my friends, is a threat to power. And there are many times in the history of humanity when a community coming together to feed its people has become a threat to an empire. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the founders of the Black Panthers in 1966, and their very first program was the Free Breakfast for Children program. And in an era when many poor black children were going to school on an empty stomach, their community organized. And in 1968, the Black Panthers set up in St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland, California, partnering with the priest, Reverend Earl A. Neal, who had previously served in Episcopal Church in the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, got together with some parishioners of the church and many neighborhood mothers, and they started to feed the children for free before they went to school every morning. By the end of the year, there were chapters of the Free Breakfast for Children program in 23 cities, feeding more than 20,000 children for free. And they fed more poor school children than the entire state of California did. And because of this, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, called the Panthers, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, and authorized the FBI to destroyed the free breakfast for children program. They forged letters to stores discouraging them from donating food. They spread rumors in the communities that the food was poisoned. And they even raided the free breakfast sites while the children ate. This is organized abandonment, the criminalization of care. Don't forget these stories, friends. They are taking place all around us right now as we sit here. In the end, the state couldn't win that fight because the empire is never as powerful as it wants you to imagine that it is. So the government subsumed that program with Congress's increase of funding to the National School Lunch Program so that poor children could eat for free in schools. Now every child in Minnesota eats for free in their schools, and we owe it to the Black Panthers, a church, and a bunch of neighborhood mothers, that grave national security threat, who stood up to the FBI in order to engage in rebellious acts of care for one another. Healing and feeding are the markers of God's rule and reign in this passage. The kingdom of God come near in the form of compassionate healing and a feast. And this should say something to us about the kind of ministry you are preparing for. The kind of ministry that we, faculty colleagues, are teaching our students to carry out. In Luther's Abide commitments, we place the value of equity alongside those of accountability, belonging, inclusion, and diversity. And we describe equity as the adoption, performance, and preservation of policies, systems, governance, and practices. And then we put the practice of justice as the expression of our commitment to equity. Or as Cornel West famously says it, justice is what love looks like in public. We are freed by grace from being turned inward in self-centered idolatry in order to turn outward toward one another in acts of compassion and endeavors of justice. But we are well acquainted with strategies to tame and spiritualize an otherwise radical and incarnational gospel. And we can distance ourselves from this story by believing that it was a miraculous story of another time, another place, possibly challenging power, but the power of another empire, nothing to do with us. But in our Abide document, we are summoned beyond disembodying the incarnational gospel with this line, quote, "We will not merely pray for justice. We must endeavor to do it." Then the climax of this passage. He takes the loaves and fish, looks to heaven, blesses them, and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to distribute. Taking, blessing, breaking, giving, and all of them eating is a direct foreshadowing of the Last Supper. And across the Gospels, this story appears in every one of them. Across the Gospels, taking, blessing, breaking, giving, eating, all is a Eucharistic formula. What Jesus is doing here for Matthew and his early gathering of Christ followers hearing this gospel is a Eucharistic act. And it is political through and through. Love taking the shape of justice. A challenge to unjust political systems, governance, and practices of empire by enacting the wild feast of God's abundance for those needing healing and a meal and a community. Depoliticized, this is a story of a magical picnic. But read in the fullness of its context, it illustrates the practice of justice as an expression of our commitment to equity in the reign of God. And that calls us all into service in places of precarity and possibility, of risk and revelation. But we have so domesticated the wild feast of grace that most of us wouldn't recognize a communion meal unless it was covered in a white parament and came in the form of a tiny piece of bread and a little sip of wine. But the same four Gospels that give us the Last Supper before Jesus' state execution also give us this Eucharistic scene, which didn't take place in an upper room, but in the wilderness. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have everyone who comes, and everyone who takes the loaves and fish, and everyone who eats it and goes away satisfied, and everyone who enjoys the feast being part of God's abundant banquet. Sometimes the Eucharistic feast just appears before us when we need it. And some of you will recognize the opportune time and will be called upon to serve the meal, even when every impulse within you that has been instilled in you says, send them away. But the call of the Spirit says, you feed them. The passage we read this morning began, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But we didn't hear what Jesus had heard before this. And it's this. His cousin, the prophetic forerunner of the Jesus movement, the one who was sent to prepare the way as a voice crying out in the wilderness, John the Baptist, has just been executed by King Herod. And what's clear at the outset of chapter 14 is that Herod has heard reports about Jesus and wondered aloud to his servants whether Jesus might be John the Baptist raised from the dead. John the Baptist's execution sets the stage for this scene of the feeding of the multitudes. Jesus and John are closely tied in the imagination of King Herod. So if you are Jesus and the disciples at this point in the story, the message could not be clearer. You are in danger too. And friends, this is where it gets real. What you're doing here in this place among these people at Luther Seminary is not without its dangers if it's done well. If we believe equity is our call and justice is our mission, in an era when compassion is being increasingly criminalized and many of our own siblings in faith portray empathy as a sin, even feeding people, even housing people, even caring for the immigrant in your midst, even protecting trans siblings in your communities will become a threat to the gatekeepers of the status quo. And the Herods of our own day will perceive your own ministry as too politically subversive if you have the audacity to engage in ministry in any way that resembles Jesus. When you sense the emerging call of abundance in the wilderness, drowning out the empire's cries of scarcity, you feed them. Take, bless, break, give, eat, all.